You don't belong here. That's what my husband hit me with, at a table full of his coworkers, in a room lit by chandeliers that cost more than my first car. Said it quiet, almost sweet, like he was doing me a favor by pointing it out. Like I was a coat rack somebody accidentally sat down at a formal dinner. By morning, a guy with 3 stars on his shoulder was standing in that same hotel lobby, staring at a photo on his phone, and dropping 2 words to his aide that were about to end my marriage before breakfast even got served. It's her. Name's Elena Marsh. For 6 years, I let my husband think I was way smaller than I actually was. I want to tell you why I let that slide, and exactly what it cost both of us the night that stopped being true. I met David Marsh at a fundraiser 8 years back, when I was working as a civilian contractor for a firm nobody outside a real narrow world had ever even heard of. David was a rising exec at a defense consulting firm, sharp suit, sharper handshake, the kind of guy who reads a room in 4 seconds flat and switches up his whole vibe to match whatever it needs. I found that impressive before I clocked it as a red flag. Told him I worked in logistics coordination, which was true in the driest, most technically accurate way a security clearance lets you be honest. 4 years before I met David, I'd worked as an intelligence liaison attached to Naval Special Ops Planning, the kind of gig where your real title lives in a system most people will never get clearance to even search. Wasn't ashamed of it, just wasn't allowed to talk about most of it, and the parts I could talk about sounded, to a civilian, boring on purpose. Kinda the whole point. David never asked many follow-ups. Looking back, I think that worked out great for him. He liked being the interesting one at dinner parties, liked being the guy whose job came with stories, the near-miss negotiations, the execs he'd charmed, the deals closed under pressure. I was cool letting him have the spotlight. Spent years in rooms where the whole goal was being the person nobody remembers afterward. Fading into the wallpaper wasn't a burden for me. It was muscle memory at that point. We got married 3 years after that fundraiser. By then, I'd left government work and taken a quieter civilian gig doing risk analysis for a shipping company. Real job, real title, nothing classified, nothing interesting enough to compete with David's stories. He liked that version of me. Steady, supportive, showing up to his work dinners in a nice dress, nodding along, laughing at his coworkers' jokes even when they weren't really funny. Here's the real wound under all this, the reason David's dismissiveness cut so deep specifically. It wasn't just about getting slept on in general. It was about a night 11 years ago I still can't talk about outside a real small circle of people who were there. A night where a call I made under about 6 seconds of pressure kept 4 guys alive who wouldn't have made it home otherwise. I don't need a parade for that. Never have. But somewhere along the way, I started needing at least one person in my day-to-day to sense there was more going on with me than a quiet woman in a nice dress laughing on cue. David never once went looking for it, and a small, patient part of me had been waiting 6 years for him to. The dinner was a black tie thing tied to a defense industry conference in D.C., the kind of night where David's firm was trying to lock down a major contract and wanted spouses there to soften the room up. I wore a navy dress I'd had for years. David wore the suit he always broke out for nights like this, the one that made him look, in his own words, like money that knows what to do with itself. Trouble started small. One of David's coworkers, a woman named Priscilla Vance who ran business development at his firm, dropped a comment about a defense modernization briefing she'd sat in on that week, something about naval special ops funding, and asked, mostly just to be nice, if I had thoughts. I had thoughts, way more than I let on. Gave a careful, general answer, informed sounding without giving up anything I wasn't supposed to. Accurate enough that Priscilla's eyebrows went up a little, the way people react when a quiet person drops something sharper than expected. David laughed it off before I even finished talking. Elena reads a lot of think pieces, he told the table, patting my hand like I was a golden retriever that fetched something impressive by accident. Don't let her fool you into thinking she knows this world. She does logistics for a shipping company. Boxes, basically. Table laughed, the polite kind you give your host's husband. My face did the thing it always does in these moments. Hold dead still, smile just enough, take it on the chin. Then, later, when I dropped one more thought, small, careful, nowhere near the edge of what I actually knew, David leaned in, voice low enough only the people close by could catch it, but not low enough to actually be private. "Elena, sweetheart, you don't belong in this conversation," he said. "You don't belong at this table, talking about this stuff, acting like you know something the rest of us don't. Let the professionals handle it." Wasn't cruel exactly. That's what made it worse. Said with the specific, casual confidence of a guy who fully believed he was being reasonable. The ground didn't just shift under that table. It cracked straight down the middle, and I felt 11 years of silence sitting right on top of the fault line. I didn't say a word back at the table. 6 years of practice doesn't just evaporate because you finally got a good enough reason to let it. Smiled, said something small and forgettable, let the conversation drift to somebody's golf handicap. But something shifted. Quiet, permanent, somewhere behind my ribs. Priscilla caught my eye across the table a minute later. The one real presence at that whole dinner. The only person who'd actually asked me a genuine question instead of a performative one. Later, in the bathroom, she found me at the sink, reapplying lipstick I didn't need, just needing somewhere to stand that wasn't that table. "That was out of pocket," Priscilla said, leaning on the counter. "What he said to you back there." "He's not wrong that I don't work in defense anymore," I said, careful. "That's not what I mean, and you know it," Priscilla said. "I've sat across from you at 4 of these dinners, Elena. You ask better questions than half the men in that room getting paid to have opinions. Don't know what you actually did before shipping logistics, none of my business. But I know condescension when I watch a man serve it up to his own wife in front of a table full of coworkers." That was the false hope. The moment I let myself believe this could get handled quiet, that maybe I could just talk to David later, privately, and something real might finally happen after 6 years of careful management. I tried. Back in the hotel room, told him what he said actually hurt, that it wasn't the first time, that I needed him to stop assuming there was nothing under the quiet. "I was joking, Elena," David said, already half undressed, already over it. "You're being sensitive. Nobody at that table thought twice about it." "I did," I said. "Well, I can't control how you take things," he said, and clicked off the lamp on his side. That was the attempted fix that failed. Lay there in the dark next to a guy who just, with zero idea what he was doing, dismissed the one part of my life I'd guarded hardest for over a decade, and did it while thinking he was the reasonable one in the room. Here's the curveball I didn't see coming. The conference the next morning had a closed VIP breakfast for a select group of defense contractors and their spouses, hosted by a 3-star admiral named Richard Okafor, there specifically to thank a small group of people whose work, some still classified, directly backed up a joint special ops initiative years back. David's firm had been trying to get an invite to that breakfast for 2 years. In his head, that was the actual reason we'd flown out for the whole conference. What David didn't know, what basically nobody in that room knew, was that Admiral Okafor was the flag officer briefed personally 11 years back on the op where I made that 6-second call that kept 4 guys alive. He'd shook my hand exactly once in a windowless, secure room and told me something I've never repeated to anyone, David included. That the report on what I did that night went all the way up to a desk most people in that industry would spend their whole careers just hoping to get near. I hadn't planned on going to that breakfast at all. Told David I had a headache. But Priscilla, clueless about any of this, just knowing she liked me and thought David had been a jerk, insisted I show up anyway. "You're more interesting than any of these people," she said. "Come annoy them with your logistics takes." So I went. And here's the detail that flips everything the audience thought they had figured out. I wasn't skipping that breakfast to dodge a confrontation. I was skipping it because, somewhere in the back of my head, I knew if Admiral Okafor was in that room, there was a real shot the version of me David had built his whole marriage around might not survive contact with the version of me that actually existed. Stood in the doorway of that breakfast room in my navy dress, coffee in hand, watching a guy with 3 stars scan the room the way career officers do. Fast, thorough, cataloging everybody. His eyes swept past me, stopped, came back. Said something quiet to his aide. Couldn't hear it yet. But I watched his face do something I recognized, because I'd trained myself for years to read exactly that kind of recognition on exactly that kind of face. That's when I knew there was no controlling what came next. Admiral Okafor crossed the room toward me with that unhurried directness of a guy who's never once needed to rush an entrance to make it land. David, over by the coffee station with two coworkers, watched this go down looking straight up confused. That particular confusion of a man realizing something's unfolding that has nothing to do with him and everything to do with the wife he left in a dark hotel room the night before. "Ms. Marsh," Admiral Okafor said, and the room actually quieted down a notch, the way rooms do around flag officers without anybody deciding to make it happen. "Been a long time." "Admiral," I said, voice steadier than I expected. "Thought about that night more than you'd probably guess," he said. "Command still uses the after-action report from that op to train new intelligence liaisons. They don't use your name, Regs, but some of us who were in that room that night never forgot whose call it actually was." Felt David's eyes land on me from across the room. Felt the exact second his confusion sharpened into something closer to panic. Here's the internal switch, the one I've been circling for 6 years without letting myself land on. Standing there, hearing a 3-star admiral talk about the biggest 6 seconds of my whole career like they actually mattered, I finally got it. Completely. I'd spent 6 years married to a guy who never once wondered hard enough to find any of this out. Not because I hid it perfectly, barely hid anything that would have taken real effort to uncover, given how many people in that industry knew some version of it. He just never wondered. And a guy who never wonders about you has already told you, quiet, over and over, exactly how much space he thinks you take up in the world. The line that crystallized the whole thing, the one I said not to David, not yet, just silently to myself, standing there in that coffee-smelling room in a navy dress that suddenly became the most honest thing in the building. I've spent 6 years shrinking myself into a marriage that never once asked me to be my full size. That was the choice you can't take back. Not divorce, not in that moment, not yet. The choice was simpler and harder in its own way. I decided right there I was done managing David's comfort at the cost of my own visibility. Whatever came next, I wasn't going back into that quiet. David crossed the room the second Admiral Okafor stepped off to greet somebody else, his face doing that specific scramble of a guy trying to piece together a version of events he could survive socially. "What was that about?" David asked, low, urgent. "Why's Admiral Okafor talking to you like—" He stopped. Watched him actually try to finish that sentence and choke on it. "Like I matter?" I said. "Like I might actually be somebody?" "Elena, what is going on? Right now, tell me," I told him. "Not everything. Most of it I'm still not allowed to touch, and some of it I wouldn't have told him even if I could. 'Cause by then I understood he hadn't earned the specifics, only the outline. Told him about the 4 years before we met. Told him, careful and general, about the op, the call, the report that apparently still trains new liaisons a decade later. Told him the logistics coordination line he heard at that fundraiser 8 years back wasn't a lie, just the driest possible truth a clearance lets you get away with. "You let me tell people you did boxes," David said, and his voice actually cracked, somewhere between shame and disbelief. "For 6 years, every dinner, in front of my coworkers. Last night I told a whole table you don't belong in that conversation." "You did," I said, "and you meant it. That's the part I need you to actually sit with, David. Not that you didn't know, get why you didn't. Some of that's on the job, not on you. But you never once looked like you wondered if there was more to me than what was convenient for you to see. That's not the same as not knowing. That's choosing not to look." Priscilla, standing a few feet off with her coffee, hadn't moved, hadn't pretended not to hear. "For what it's worth," she said quiet, to both of us but really to David, "some of us clocked there was more to her a long time ago. You just never asked the right questions at the right dinners." David had nothing. First time in 6 years, In a room full of people whose opinions genuinely mattered to his career, my husband stood there totally empty-handed, and the truth, mine, not his, landed clean, in broad daylight, in front of exactly the crowd he always cared most about impressing. The rest of the conference happened around us in a weird fog. David's firm didn't land the contract they'd been chasing, not because of anything from that breakfast turned out, but the timing made it feel, to David, like cosmic payback, which told me plenty about where his priorities had actually been sitting the whole time. He didn't spiral into some big apology tour, not who David is, and I'd stopped expecting movie endings from real people way before that morning. Got quiet on the flight home. Genuinely quiet, not for show wounded, which was new. Few days later, he told me he'd been chewing on what Priscilla said, about never asking the right questions at the right dinners, and that it stuck somewhere he couldn't shake. What actually caught me off guard in the days after wasn't anger. It was grief. That specific grief of realizing how much of my own life I'd spent managing somebody else's comfort at the cost of being fully known by the guy who was supposed to know me best. Finally getting seen didn't erase the 6 years I spent making myself small so David could stay the most interesting person at every table. The small detail that told me the world had actually shifted. About 2 weeks later, at a much smaller dinner with just 2 other couples, somebody asked what I used to do before shipping logistics. David, no hesitation, no joke, no hand pat, said, "Elena did work I'm not allowed to know the details of. Work that still trains people in that field today. Learn not to ask her to make herself smaller than that." Wasn't dramatic. Nobody clapped. But it was the first time in 6 years he described me right, in public. And I felt that land somewhere deep and quiet in my chest. David and I are still married, still working through what 6 years of a carefully managed marriage actually cost us both. We see a counselor now, every other week, an office with a white noise machine humming outside the door. We're not fixed. Don't think either of us buys into fixed anymore, not the old way. But we're honest now, in a way we weren't before. And some weeks, that honesty's harder to sit with than the old silence ever was. Priscilla and I are real friends now, not just conference circuit acquaintances. Took me to lunch a month after that breakfast and said, over salads neither of us finished, "Meant what I said back there. Clocked you a long time ago. Took an admiral for your own husband to catch up." "That's a wild thing to have to be true," I said. "It is," she said. "But you're not managing anybody's comfort at my table. That much I can promise. No framed photo on our mantle, no big dramatic symbol of change. What's different is smaller and harder to snap a picture of. David asks me real questions now, and actually waits for the real answer instead of the convenient one. Some days he still whiffs it. Some days I still catch myself shrinking out of habit before I remember I don't have to anymore. I think about Admiral Okafor's 2 words more than almost anything else from that whole conference. Not the confrontation, not David's face falling apart in that coffee-smelling room. Just those 2 words, said quiet to an aide before any of the rest went down. It's her. 6 years of getting slept on, undone by 2 words from a guy who'd actually bothered, once, a long time ago, to see me clear enough to remember. If there's somebody in your life who's decided, without ever quite saying it out loud, that you don't belong in certain rooms, certain conversations, certain versions of your own story, I just ask you to notice how long you've let that verdict stand unchallenged. Some of us don't get an admiral to walk in and say our name like it matters. Sometimes you gotta be the one who finally stops managing everybody else's comfort long enough to say it yourself.